Can I give you some advice? Well, okay, what qualifies me to give you advice? Why and when should you listen to what other people have to say, particularly me? Giving advice doesn't seem to be too problematic. Our lives are surrounded by people giving advice. Financial advice, makeup advice, career advice, advice on what policies to adopt or to reject, and what candidates to put into office and which ones to remove. Advice on how to teach and how to create good videos. I promise I will not be offering advice on how to produce good videos or makeup advice. However, I've spent my whole life studying value. I think I can say something useful about how to distinguish what is good from what is bad. And in doing this, I've spent much more time looking at what makes for good and bad arguments than I've spent looking at what makes for good or bad videos, obviously. When it comes to making evaluations, there are two types that are particularly important: evaluations relative to one's interests and desires, and evaluations relative to the well-being of a community, though these can't be entirely separated. One way to secure your own interests and the interests of those you care about is by creating a community in which those interests are secured. So let me tell you something that always happens when I look at other people's advice. Yesterday, for example, I was looking at some advice on climate change, an author defending the Green New Deal. As always happens, whenever I go through any proposal, I reach a point where I say to myself, there's your mistake. There is where your recommendations go off the rails. If only you knew what I know. Here, let me give you some advice. And then I've trained myself to think, fortunately, God has made me the master of all wisdom and virtue, and if you listen to me, all of your problems will be solved. Which, of course, I deliver in a tone of self-mockery. I say it to remind myself that everybody thinks that they're the ones who've come up with all of the correct answers and that everybody else is mistaken. No doubt the person whose suggestions I'm reading about, if they were to look at my own ideas, would reach a point where they think, this is your mistake. This is where your recommendations go off the rails. If you only knew what I know. So I've gotten myself into this habit, whenever I find myself being critical of somebody else's views, asking what they would say in criticism of my own. And it's this that I find to be much more rare than it should be. I want to stress that the perspective I'm talking about here doesn't ask why that person believes they are right. It asks, why would that person believe that I am wrong? If I were to present my ideas to this person, where would they say that I made my mistake? This is a piece of advice that I'll tell my students at some point when we're talking about assignments, and they're to produce a paper on some topic of moral concern. Students will often do research on what positions other people hold and their reasons for holding it. But one question that it's also very important to research is, why would they reject my position? And that's a different question. Sometimes this exposes implications about my own view that I've not considered. Sometimes I change my views, a couple of times quite radically. Often, almost always, I draw the conclusion that the situation is more complicated than I thought it was. I make changes and alterations to handle issues I didn't think of on my own. We are all, every one of us, much better at finding the mistakes in the views of others than we are in seeing the mistakes in our own views. I'm fairly certain that you've experienced this. You've listened and read somebody defending some position and came to a point where you can say, that's a mistake. Why can't they see it? People are quite obviously blind to the faults of their own position, and much less blind to the faults of the positions of other people. So why not take advantage of this? If other people are better at seeing the problems in your view than you are, then when you want to discover the potential problems with your view, look at what others are telling you. So this would be my advice. Listen, really listen, and even seek out those who have a criticism of your position. First, because God did not make you the font of all wisdom and virtue. And second, we're all much better at seeing the flaws in other people's positions than we are in our own. So why not ask other people, where have I made my mistake? Where do you reject this position?